The bells had not even finished ringing when Alara felt the first cold wave of fear pass through her chest. She stood near the edge of the grand hall, half hidden behind a marble pillar, watching Prince Aldrich take his place at the center of the room. Golden light poured down from tall windows, but none of it reached her. She had expected to feel joy on this day. Instead, something inside her had gone quiet, like a candle pinched out by unseen fingers. She had known Aldrich long before anyone called him a prince who mattered. Back then, he was simply a young man with tired eyes and a habit of staying up late, worried about a father who ruled with an iron hand and little warmth. Alara had been the one who listened when no one else would. She had been the steady hand when his world tilted. Now, as the royal families of 3 kingdoms filled the hall in silk and jewels, she wondered if the boy she had known still existed inside the man standing at the front of the room. The archbishop lifted the crown, and a hush spread across the hall like a held breath. Alara watched Aldrich's face. He did not look nervous. He looked distant, as though his mind had already left the room and traveled somewhere she could not follow. She told herself it was simply the weight of the moment. Kings did not smile the way ordinary men did. Kings carried burdens too heavy for soft expressions. But then his eyes moved, just once, a quick glance across the crowd, searching for someone. Alara's heart lifted, thinking perhaps he searched for her. Instead, his gaze settled briefly on Lady Seraphine, daughter of the Duke of Ashworth, seated in the front row with her family's banner draped behind her chair. The look lasted only a second, yet it carried more meaning than any of the words spoken that day. Alara's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that a man about to become king would naturally glance at powerful families, at allies, at the people whose loyalty could keep a throne standing, or bring it crashing down. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. The archbishop's voice rose again, calling upon the gathered nobles to witness the crowning of their new sovereign. Alara watched as the crown settled onto Aldrich's head, gleaming under the candlelight, and the entire hall erupted into applause. Trumpets sounded. Doves were released from cages near the ceiling, filling the air with white wings and sudden movement. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. And yet Alara felt as though she were watching the scene from behind glass, unable to reach through it. After the ceremony, the crowd moved like a great tide toward the banquet hall, where long tables had been set with silver plates and towers of fruit. Musicians began to play a lively tune, and laughter spilled from every corner of the room. Alara followed the crowd, trying to shake the unease that clung to her like damp air. She found a place near one of the long tables, close enough to watch Aldrich, but far enough not to draw attention. He was surrounded almost immediately by ministers, eager to offer their congratulations, by foreign dignitaries, hoping to secure his favor, and by nobles who had waited years for a chance to whisper into a king's ear. Alara understood this was simply the nature of power. A crown did not come with privacy. It came with 100 hands reaching for attention, all at once, all demanding to be seen. Still, she waited for a moment, when Aldrich might catch her eye, might offer her a small smile the way he used to when a room grew too loud, and he needed a single friendly face to anchor him. That moment did not come. Instead, she watched Lady Seraphine approach him with practiced grace, her emerald gown catching the candlelight as she offered a formal bow. Aldrich's expression shifted, subtly but unmistakably, into the polite mask expected of a king greeting an important guest. Alara told herself this too was simply protocol. Kings were expected to be gracious to everyone, especially those whose families held power over trade routes and armies. An older woman appeared at Alara's side, someone she recognized as one of the palace's longtime advisors, a woman named Margot who had served 3 generations of the royal family. Margot's eyes were kind but careful as she studied Alara's face. "You look as though you are carrying the weight of the crown yourself," Margot said gently. Alara tried to smile. Margot glanced toward Aldrich, then back at Alara, her expression unreadable for a moment, before softening into something like sympathy. "These days are always longer than they appear. There is much happening that the eye cannot see." The words settled uneasily in Alara's stomach. She wanted to ask what Margot meant, but before she could speak, a trumpet call announced the beginning of the formal toasts, and the crowd's attention shifted entirely toward the front of the hall. Alara watched as Aldrich rose to speak, his voice steady and confident, promising prosperity and unity to a kingdom that had waited years for a strong ruler. The crowd cheered. Goblets were raised. Alara raised hers too. though her hand trembled slightly as she did. Throughout the evening, she searched for an opportunity to speak with him privately, even for a moment. But every time she drew near, another minister or noble intercepted him first, eager to secure his attention before the night ended. She began to understand something she had not fully accepted before this day. A king's time no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the kingdom, to the court, to everyone except the people who had known him before the crown existed. Near midnight, as the banquet began to wind down, and guests drifted toward smaller conversations in quieter corners, Ilara finally found a moment. Aldrich had stepped away from the main crowd, toward a balcony overlooking the palace gardens, likely seeking a brief escape from the noise. Ilara followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She found him standing alone, looking out over the moonlit gardens, his crown still resting on his head, though he had loosened the ceremonial collar around his neck. For a moment, he looked less like a king, and more like the young man she remembered, tired, and searching for a quiet place to breathe. "Aldrich," she said softly, using his name without title, the way she always had. He turned, and for a brief second, something familiar flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by a practiced calm that felt foreign to her. "Ilara, I did not expect you to still be here." The words struck her strangely. Where else would she be, if not by his side on the most important night of his life? "I wanted to speak with you," she said, "even if only for a moment." He nodded, though his eyes drifted briefly toward the doors behind them, as though expecting someone to interrupt at any moment. "Of course. What is it you wanted to say?" Ilara hesitated. She had imagined this conversation a dozen times throughout the evening, yet now that the moment had arrived, the words felt harder to find. "I wanted to know if you are well, if all of this," she gestured toward the hall behind them, "has not been too overwhelming." Aldrich's expression softened slightly, though something guarded remained behind his eyes. "It has been a great deal to carry. There are obligations now that I did not fully understand until today. The crown does not simply sit on one's head. It reshapes everything around a person." "Does it reshape everything?" Ilara asked quietly, unable to keep the question from slipping out. He studied her for a long moment, and in that silence, Ilara felt as though an entire conversation passed between them without a single word being spoken. Finally he said, "There are conversations we must have, Ilara, but not tonight. Tonight belongs to the kingdom." The answer was gentle, yet it landed like a closed door. Ilara nodded, though her throat had tightened painfully. "Of course," she said, "tonight belongs to the kingdom." He offered her a small, tired smile before excusing himself, called away by a minister who appeared at the balcony entrance with an urgent expression. Ilara remained alone on the balcony for several minutes, watching the gardens below, trying to steady the storm building inside her chest. She thought of all the years they had shared before this night, quiet evenings spent talking about nothing important, walks through gardens much like the one below, moments of laughter that had felt effortless and real. She wondered when exactly the distance between them had begun to grow. Had it started tonight, with the weight of the crown settling onto his head, or had it been growing slowly for months, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to reveal itself fully? As the night wore on, Ilara returned briefly to the banquet hall, though she found it difficult to remain among the laughter and celebration. She excused herself early, offering polite farewells to those who noticed her leaving, and made her way through the quiet corridors of the palace toward the guest quarters, where she had stayed for years. Her cabin, as she called it, was a modest but comfortable room near the edge of the palace grounds, close enough to the main buildings to feel connected, yet distant enough to remind her, in small ways, that she had never truly belonged among the nobility. She had never minded this before. It had felt like a peaceful corner of the world, a place where she could rest, after long days spent supporting Aldrich through the demands of his position. Tonight, however, the walk back felt longer than usual. The corridors seemed emptier, the shadows deeper. She passed several servants preparing for the following day's celebrations, their voices hushed with excitement about the new king's reign. Ilara offered polite nods but said little, her mind still replaying the brief conversation on the balcony. When she finally reached her cabin, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment, letting the silence of the room settle around her. She removed her shawl and set it aside, then moved toward the small window overlooking the gardens, watching distant lantern lights flicker across the grounds, where the celebration continued without her. She told herself that everything would return to normal once the initial excitement of the coronation faded. Kings needed time to adjust to their new responsibilities. Perhaps in a few days, once the ceremonies and formal obligations settled into routine, Aldrich would find a quiet moment to speak with her properly, to explain the distance she had felt growing between them. Yet even as she tried to comfort herself with this thought, a small, persistent voice in the back of her mind refused to be silenced. It reminded her of Margot's careful words, of the glance Aldrich had shared with Lady Seraphine during the ceremony, of the practiced formality in his voice when he had spoken to her on the balcony. Something had shifted, and she feared it was not simply the natural adjustment to new responsibilities. She sat by the window for a long while, watching the stars above the palace gardens, listening to the distant sound of music and laughter drifting from the banquet hall. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at her, and she moved toward her bed, though sleep did not come easily. Her mind continued to turn over every detail of the day, searching for reassurance she could not quite find. As she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she had no way of knowing that the quiet unease settling over her heart was only the beginning of a night that would change everything she believed about her place in Aldrich's life. Somewhere beyond her cabin walls, decisions were already being made, conversations were already taking place, and the foundation of everything she had built over the years was quietly beginning to shift beneath her feet. The celebration continued long into the night, but for Alara, the coronation had already ended the moment she stepped away from that balcony, carrying with her a question she was not yet ready to answer. Morning arrived at the palace with a strange kind of hush, as though the entire estate was recovering from the excitement of the night before. Alara woke earlier than usual, her body tired from restless sleep, her mind still circling the events of the coronation. She lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the unease she felt was simply exhaustion and nothing more. She rose eventually and dressed in a simple dress, choosing comfort over the formal attire she had worn the previous day. As she moved through her morning routine, she caught glimpses of herself in the small mirror near her window, noticing the tired lines beneath her eyes, the tension held tightly in her shoulders. She told herself that today would be better. Today, perhaps, she would find a chance to speak with Aldrich properly, away from the crowds and the pressures of the ceremony. When she stepped outside her cabin, the palace grounds were already busy with servants, clearing away decorations from the previous night's celebration. Long tables were being folded and carried away, and gardeners moved carefully among the flower beds, restoring order to paths that had been trampled by hundreds of guests. Alara walked slowly toward the main palace building, greeting familiar faces along the way, though her mind remained elsewhere. She found Margot near the entrance to the eastern wing, overseeing a group of servants organizing correspondence that had arrived overnight from various kingdoms, offering congratulations to the new king. Margot looked up as Alara approached, her expression softening with recognition. "You look as though you did not sleep well," Margot said, setting aside a stack of letters. "It was a long night," Alara admitted. "I hope to speak with Aldrich this morning, if he has time." Margot's expression shifted slightly, something careful entering her eyes. "The council has requested his presence for most of the day. There are matters requiring immediate attention now that the coronation has concluded." Alara nodded, though disappointment settled heavily in her chest. "Of course. I understand there is much to attend to." Margot studied her for a long moment before speaking again, her voice lower than before. "Alara, I have known you for many years, since you first arrived at this palace, as a young woman, uncertain of her place among us. I have always respected your quiet strength, and I do not say what I am about to say lightly." Alara felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" Margot glanced around, ensuring no one else stood close enough to overhear. "There have been discussions among the council for several months now, discussions regarding alliances that would strengthen the kingdom's position. The Duke of Ashworth holds significant influence over the northern trade routes, and his daughter, Lady Seraphine, has been mentioned frequently in these discussions." Ilara's stomach tightened painfully. "Mentioned in what way?" Margot hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue, yet unwilling to leave Alara in ignorance. "In the context of marriage, Alara, a union between the crown and the Ashworth family would secure resources and loyalty that the kingdom desperately needs, particularly given the tensions along the northern border." The words landed like a physical blow, though Ilara forced herself to remain composed. Has Aldrich spoken of this himself? Not directly to me, Margot admitted, but the council has pressed the matter repeatedly, and a king newly crowned cannot easily ignore such pressure, especially in his first months on the throne. The kingdom's stability often depends on decisions made quickly, before enemies or rivals can exploit uncertainty. Ilara absorbed this information slowly, feeling the pieces of the previous night's unease settling into a clearer, more painful picture. The glance Aldrich had shared with Lady Seraphine during the ceremony, the formal distance in his voice when they had spoken on the balcony, the sense that his attention had already begun drifting toward obligations she could not compete with. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. "Thank you for telling me," Ilara said quietly, though her voice trembled slightly. Margot reached out and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "I tell you this not to cause you pain, but because I believe you deserve to understand the truth, rather than be caught unprepared. Whatever happens, you have always carried yourself with grace, Ilara. That will not change, regardless of what decisions are made in the coming days." Ilara offered a small, grateful smile, though her heart felt heavier than it had in years. She excused herself shortly after, needing time alone to process what she had learned. She wandered through the palace gardens, the same gardens she had walked with Aldrich countless times over the years, trying to reconcile the memories of their shared past with the uncertain future now stretching ahead of her. As she walked, she noticed several nobles gathered near the garden's central fountain, engaged in quiet conversation. She recognized Lord Bennet, a longtime advisor to the royal family, speaking with two other ministers whose names she could not immediately recall. She slowed her pace, catching fragments of their conversation as she passed. The Ashworth alliance would settle the northern border disputes within the year, Lord Bennet was saying. The Duke has already indicated his willingness to proceed quickly, provided the king shows genuine commitment to the arrangement. One of the other ministers nodded. The kingdom cannot afford prolonged uncertainty, not with the neighboring territories watching so closely. A strong alliance would send a clear message of stability. Ilara continued walking, her chest tightening with each word she overheard. She had suspected the truth already, thanks to Margot's warning. Yet hearing it confirmed so openly among the palace's advisors made the reality impossible to ignore. This was not simply idle gossip or uncertain rumor. This was a decision already being shaped, discussed among the very people who held influence over the kingdom's future, and by extension, over Aldrich's future as well. She found a quiet bench near the edge of the garden, hidden partially behind a row of tall hedges, and sat down heavily, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of all the years she had spent by Aldrich's side, supporting him through difficult decisions, offering comfort during moments of doubt, sharing in small joys that had felt, at the time, like the foundation of something lasting. She had never imagined a crown could dismantle all of that so quickly, so completely. Yet she also understood, even through her pain, the impossible position Aldrich now occupied. He was no longer simply a man free to choose his own path. He carried the weight of an entire kingdom's stability, and decisions that might have seemed unthinkable only weeks earlier now carried the full force of political necessity. She did not know whether to feel anger toward him or simply sorrow for the complicated position fate had placed him in. As the afternoon wore on, Ilara remained largely alone, avoiding the busier areas of the palace where she might encounter reminders of the previous night's celebration. She spent time in the palace library, attempting to distract herself with old texts and quiet corners, though her mind refused to settle. Every few minutes her thoughts returned to the conversation she had overheard, to Margot's careful warning, to the memory of Aldrich's distant expression on the balcony. Near evening, she finally summoned the courage to seek him out directly, hoping that despite the council's demands, he might spare a few moments to speak with her honestly. She made her way toward his private study, a room she had visited countless times over the years, often finding him there late at night, working through difficult decisions with quiet determination. She found the door partially open, and through the gap, she could see Aldrich seated at his desk, surrounded by scattered documents and maps. Lord Bennet stood nearby, speaking in low, urgent tones. Ilara hesitated at the threshold, unwilling to interrupt, yet unable to look away. "The Duke expects an answer within the week," Lord Bennet was saying. "Delaying further will only weaken our position at the negotiating table." Aldrich rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in his posture. "I understand the urgency, Bennet, but these are not decisions to be made lightly. regardless of the pressure from the council. With respect, Your Majesty, the northern border cannot withstand further uncertainty. The Ashworth Alliance offers the strongest path toward stability. Personal considerations, however genuine, cannot outweigh the security of the entire kingdom. Alara felt her breath catch painfully in her chest. She stepped back from the doorway, unwilling to hear more, her heart pounding with a mixture of heartbreak and quiet resignation. She retreated down the corridor, her steps quick and unsteady, tears threatening despite her attempts to remain composed. She did not stop until she reached the palace gardens once more, finding refuge beneath a large oak tree near the edge of the property, far from the busy corridors and watchful eyes of the court. She allowed herself, finally, to cry quietly, releasing the tension and heartbreak she had carried throughout the day. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Alara wiped her eyes and forced herself to breathe steadily. She understood now, with painful clarity, the direction events were moving. Whatever bond she had shared with Aldrich over the years was being weighed against the needs of an entire kingdom, and she feared, deep in her heart, which side of that balance would ultimately win. She remained in the garden until darkness fully settled over the palace grounds, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, trying to gather the strength she would need for whatever conversations lay ahead. She did not yet know what decision she would make, but she understood, with growing certainty, that the life she had known within these palace walls was beginning to change in ways she could not control. Eventually, she rose from beneath the oak tree and made her way back toward her cabin, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had learned throughout the day. The palace behind her glowed with warm lantern light, filled with the quiet hum of a kingdom settling into its new era. Yet for Alara, the warmth of that light felt distant, as though it belonged to a world she was slowly being asked to leave behind. 3 days passed before Alara saw Aldrich again, and during that time, the palace transformed around her in ways that made her feel increasingly like a stranger within its walls. Servants who had once greeted her warmly now offered polite but distant nods, as though sensing a shift in her standing, before anyone had spoken a single confirming word. She told herself she was imagining the change, that grief and worry were coloring her perception of everyday interactions. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. On the 4th morning, a young page arrived at her cabin, carrying a folded note, sealed with the royal insignia. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, unsure whether to hope for reassurance or brace herself for disappointment. The message was brief, written in Aldrich's familiar handwriting, though the words felt formal in a way that unsettled her. The note requested her presence in the small council chamber that afternoon, a room typically reserved for private meetings between the king and his closest advisors. Alara read the message twice, searching for warmth in the careful phrasing, yet finding only the polite distance that had characterized every interaction since the coronation. She spent the following hours preparing herself, both physically and emotionally, for whatever conversation awaited her. She chose her clothing carefully, wanting to appear composed rather than desperate, dignified rather than pleading. She reminded herself, repeatedly, that whatever news Aldrich intended to share, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through difficult moments throughout her life. When the appointed hour arrived, Alara made her way through the palace corridors, her heart pounding steadily with each step. She passed several nobles along the way, some of whom offered curious glances, as though aware that something significant was unfolding, though unable to identify exactly what. She kept her expression composed, refusing to let uncertainty show on her face. The small council chamber was quieter than the grand halls she typically associated with palace business, furnished simply with a long table and tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Aldrich stood near one of these windows when she entered, his back turned toward the door, his posture rigid with what appeared to be exhaustion or tension, perhaps both. He turned as she entered, and for a brief moment, the mask of formality slipped, revealing something closer to the young man she had known for years, tired and uncertain despite the crown he now carried. "Alara," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied, though her voice carried a careful edge she could not fully hide. He gestured toward a chair near the table, and she seated herself, watching as he remained standing, seemingly unable to settle into stillness. Several long moments passed in silence before he finally spoke again. "I owe you an honest conversation," he began, his voice measured yet strained. "One I should have offered days ago, rather than allowing circumstances to speak in my place." Ilara remained silent, waiting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The council has been discussing matters of alliance for several months now, Aldrich continued. Matters concerning the northern border and the stability of trade routes that our kingdom depends upon heavily. These discussions have included the possibility of a union between the crown and the Ashworth family. I am aware, Ilara said quietly, unable to keep a slight tremor from her voice. Aldrich's expression shifted, surprise flickering briefly across his features. You know already? Margot spoke with me, and I overheard enough from Lord Bennet to understand the direction these discussions are taking. Aldrich exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Ilara recognized from years of watching him navigate difficult moments. I did not want you to learn of this through rumor or overheard conversation. I intended to speak with you myself, though I confess, I struggled to find the right words. There are no right words for a conversation like this, Ilara replied, her voice steadier now, though sorrow still colored every syllable. Only honest ones, or dishonest ones. I would prefer honesty, whatever pain it brings. Aldrich nodded slowly, moving finally to sit across from her at the table, his eyes meeting hers directly, for the first time since she had entered the room. The council believes the Ashworth alliance is essential for the kingdom's stability, particularly given recent tensions along the northern border. They have pressed the matter repeatedly since my coronation, insisting that delay would weaken our position significantly. And what do you believe? Ilara asked, watching him closely. He hesitated, clearly weighing his response carefully. I believe the kingdom's stability matters more than my own preferences. I believe a king's choices cannot always align with his personal desires, especially in the early days of his reign, when every decision is scrutinized by allies and enemies alike. That is not quite an answer to my question, Ilara observed gently. Aldrich's expression softened with something like regret. No, I suppose it is not. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. Ilara, you have meant a great deal to me over the years. I do not say this lightly, nor do I say it merely to soften difficult news. You were present during some of the most difficult moments of my life, long before I ever expected to wear this crown. But, Ilara said quietly, sensing the word approaching before he spoke it. But circumstances have changed in ways neither of us anticipated, Aldrich continued, his voice heavy with something between apology and resignation. The council's pressure regarding the Ashworth alliance has grown too strong to ignore indefinitely. I have not yet given my final answer, but I fear the path forward may require decisions that will affect us both in ways I wish were not necessary. Ilara absorbed his words slowly, feeling the careful distance in his phrasing, the diplomatic language that avoided direct confirmation, while still conveying a clear message. She had hoped, despite everything she had learned over the previous days, that he might offer some reassurance, some indication that their bond remained stronger than political necessity. Instead, she found only careful uncertainty, wrapped in language designed to soften an outcome that seemed increasingly inevitable. I understand the position you are in, she said finally, her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest. I do not envy the burdens you now carry, but I would ask one thing of you, if you are willing to grant it. Anything, Aldrich said, leaning forward slightly. Honesty, Ilara replied. Not careful diplomatic phrasing, designed to avoid difficult truths, but genuine honesty about what you believe will happen, and what you intend to do. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the weight of her request. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. I believe the council will continue pressing until I agree to the Ashworth alliance. I believe, given the current political climate, I may have little choice but to accept their recommendation eventually, regardless of my personal feelings on the matter. The words, though softly spoken, struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. She had suspected this outcome, had prepared herself as best she could throughout the previous days, yet hearing it confirmed directly still carried a devastating weight she had not fully anticipated. Thank you for your honesty, she said quietly, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Aldrich reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, though not quite touching. Ilara, I never intended for circumstances to unfold this way. If there were another path available to me, one that did not require sacrificing what we have built together, I would choose it without hesitation. But there is no other path, Ilara said, more statement than question. Not one the council will accept easily, Aldrich admitted, sorrow evident in his voice. They sat in silence for several long moments, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Ilara understood, with painful clarity, that whatever bond they had shared over the years was now being measured against the needs of an entire kingdom, and that measurement seemed destined to conclude in a manner that would leave her without a place in his life moving forward. Eventually, she rose from her chair, gathering what remained of her composure. I appreciate you speaking with me honestly, even though the truth is difficult to accept. I would ask for time to consider what this means for my own future, if you are willing to grant it. Of course, Aldrich said quickly, rising as well. Take whatever time you need, Ilara. I will not rush you toward any decision. She nodded, offering a small, sorrowful smile before making her way toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused, glancing back at him one final time. I hope whatever path you choose, that you find the peace and stability you are seeking for the kingdom. I truly do. Aldrich's expression carried visible pain as he watched her leave, though he said nothing further, seemingly understanding that words alone could not soften the reality now settling between them. Ilara walked slowly back through the palace corridors, her heart heavy with grief, yet strangely steadier than she had felt in days, now that the uncertain fear had been replaced with painful, honest clarity. She spent the remainder of the day alone in her cabin, processing the conversation and beginning, slowly, to consider what her future might look like beyond the palace walls she had called home for so many years. In the days following her conversation with Aldrich, Ilara found herself increasingly withdrawn from the daily rhythms of palace life. She no longer joined the small gatherings of court ladies who met each afternoon in the Eastern Gallery, nor did she attend the evening readings that had once been a source of quiet enjoyment for her. Instead, she spent long hours in her cabin, or wandering the quieter paths of the palace gardens, trying to make sense of the future now stretching uncertainly ahead of her. Word of the potential Ashworth alliance had begun spreading through the court, carried along whispered conversations among servants and nobles alike. Ilara noticed the subtle changes in how people treated her, some offering sympathetic glances, others simply avoiding her gaze altogether, as though uncertain how to behave around a woman whose position within the palace seemed increasingly precarious. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens near the Eastern Fountain, she encountered Lady Seraphine directly for the first time since the coronation. The young noblewoman was accompanied by 2 attendants, dressed in fine silk that caught the afternoon light beautifully, her posture carrying the confident grace of someone accustomed to admiration and respect. Ilara considered avoiding the encounter entirely, yet something within her resisted the urge to retreat. She continued walking, meeting Lady Seraphine's gaze directly as their paths crossed near the fountain's edge. Lady Ilara, Seraphine said, her tone polite, though carrying an underlying formality that suggested careful awareness of the situation between them. I hope you are well. As well as can be expected, Ilara replied evenly, refusing to let bitterness color her voice. And you, my lady? Seraphine's expression shifted slightly, something almost sympathetic entering her eyes despite the circumstances surrounding them. I confess, this situation is not one I sought out deliberately. My father's ambitions regarding the Northern Alliance existed long before the king's coronation. I find myself, much like you, navigating circumstances shaped by forces larger than personal preference. The admission surprised Ilara, though she recognized genuine honesty within it. I do not hold you personally responsible for the council's decisions, my lady. These are difficult times for everyone involved, regardless of the roles we have been assigned. Seraphine studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. You have known the king for many years, I understand, long before he wore the crown. Since we were both quite young, Ilara confirmed quietly. Then you understand him in ways I likely never will, regardless of what arrangement the council ultimately decides upon, Seraphine said, her voice carrying unexpected gentleness. I do not envy your position, Lady Ilara. Truly, I do not. The conversation left Ilara with unexpected clarity, recognizing that Lady Seraphine, too, occupied a position shaped by political necessity rather than personal desire. It did little to ease the pain building within her heart, yet it softened, slightly, the anger she had begun harboring toward the young noblewoman, whose presence had come to symbolize everything threatening to unravel her life within the palace. Later that same day, Ilara sought out Margot once more, hoping for guidance amid the uncertainty consuming her thoughts. She found the older woman in the palace library, surrounded by ledgers detailing the kingdom's financial obligations following the coronation celebrations. "You look troubled," Margot observed, setting aside her work as Alara approached. "I spoke with Lady Seraphine today," Alara admitted, seating herself across from Margot. "She seems, surprisingly, to bear no ill will toward me, despite everything unfolding around us." Margot nodded slowly. "She is not unkind, from what I have observed. Her situation mirrors your own in many respects, though the outcome favors her rather than working against her." "What do you believe will happen, Margot?" "Truly?" Alara asked, her voice carrying quiet desperation she could no longer fully suppress. Margot considered the question carefully before responding. "I believe the council will continue pressing until Aldrich agrees to the alliance. Political necessity rarely yields easily to personal preference, particularly during the fragile early months of a new reign. I have witnessed similar situations throughout my years serving this family, and I fear the pattern rarely favors those without formal standing at court." The words, though gently spoken, confirmed Alara's growing fears. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that circumstances might shift in her favor, that Aldrich's affection for her might ultimately outweigh the council's political calculations. Yet everything she observed and heard throughout the palace suggested otherwise, painting an increasingly clear picture of an outcome she felt powerless to prevent. "What would you advise, if I asked for your counsel?" Alara asked quietly. Margot's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I would advise you to consider carefully what future you wish to build for yourself, Alara, independent of whatever decisions the crown ultimately makes. You are a capable, intelligent woman, deserving of a life defined by your own choices, rather than circumstances dictated by political necessity. Whatever happens with the Ashworth alliance, you need not remain trapped within a situation that no longer serves your happiness." The advice, though difficult to hear, carried an undeniable wisdom that settled slowly within Alara's thoughts over the following hours. She began, for the first time since the coronation, to consider seriously what life beyond the palace walls might look like, what possibilities existed for her, beyond the identity she had built as companion, to a man now bound increasingly tightly to obligations she could not share. That evening, as she returned to her cabin, she found herself studying the modest room with new eyes, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, how temporary her presence within these walls had always been, regardless of how many years she had called this place home. She had built her identity around her connection to Aldrich, around the quiet support she offered during difficult moments, around a bond she had believed unshakable, despite the pressures of court politics. Yet now, faced with the reality of an alliance that threatened to reshape everything she had known, she began to understand that perhaps true strength required recognizing when a chapter had reached its natural conclusion, however painful that recognition might be. She did not yet know what decision she would ultimately make, but she understood, with growing certainty, that the path forward would require courage, unlike anything she had needed before. As night fell over the palace grounds, Alara sat quietly by her window, watching the distant lights of the main palace building, wondering what conversations were unfolding behind those illuminated windows, what decisions were being weighed by men who held power over futures they would never personally experience. She felt, for the first time in years, entirely uncertain about what tomorrow might bring, yet strangely resolved to face whatever came with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment before this one. A week passed, and the palace settled into a strange rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely foreign to Alara. She continued her daily routines, tending to small responsibilities that had once given her purpose, yet everything carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that colored even the simplest moments. She noticed Aldrich occasionally from a distance, always surrounded by advisors, always engaged in conversations she was no longer invited to join. One morning, while returning from a walk through the eastern gardens, Alara encountered a young servant named Rosalind, someone she had grown fond of over the years despite the difference in their stations. Rosalind approached hesitantly, glancing around as though ensuring privacy before speaking. "My lady," Rosalind said quietly, "I overheard something yesterday that I believe you should know, though I hesitate to share it." Alara's heart quickened with familiar dread. "Please, tell me." Rosalind glanced around once more before continuing. The Duke of Ashworth arrived at the palace yesterday evening, along with several of his advisors. I overheard servants preparing rooms for an extended stay, suggesting negotiations regarding the alliance may be reaching their final stages. The news struck Ilara with quiet, devastating clarity. She had known this moment would eventually arrive, yet hearing confirmation that formal negotiations were now underway made the reality impossible to ignore any longer. Thank you for telling me, Rosalind. I know this could not have been an easy thing to share. I only wished for you to be prepared, my lady, Rosalind said gently. Whatever happens. Ilara thanked her once more, before continuing toward her cabin, her thoughts spinning with the implications of what she had just learned. She understood, with growing certainty, that time was running short, that whatever decision she needed to make regarding her own future would need to happen soon, before circumstances outside her control forced her hand entirely. That afternoon, she sought out a quiet corner of the palace library, hoping to find clarity amid the confusion swirling within her thoughts. She had barely settled into a chair near the tall windows when she noticed Lord Bennet entering the library, accompanied by an unfamiliar man dressed in fine traveling clothes, likely one of the Duke's advisors. She remained still, hidden partially behind a tall bookshelf, listening as the two men settled at a nearby table, apparently believing themselves alone. The Duke grows impatient, the unfamiliar man said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. He has traveled a great distance expecting swift resolution to these negotiations. Further delay risks insulting his patience, and by extension, his willingness to proceed with the alliance. Lord Bennet sighed heavily. The king understands the urgency, though he continues to seek reassurance regarding certain personal matters before finalizing his decision. Personal matters? The man repeated, his tone carrying clear disapproval. Surely the king understands that a crown carries responsibilities beyond personal preference. The northern border cannot withstand further uncertainty, and the Duke's patience, however considerable, is not unlimited. I have advised him accordingly, Lord Bennet replied. I believe he will reach a decision within the coming days, once he has settled certain lingering concerns. The conversation continued for several more minutes, though Ilara heard little else beyond the confirmation that decisions were nearing their conclusion, that whatever hope she had harbored for a different outcome was rapidly diminishing with each passing day. She remained hidden until the two men eventually departed, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had overheard. She left the library shortly after, seeking the solitude of her cabin once more, needing time alone to process the accelerating pace of events unfolding around her. As she walked through the familiar corridors, she found herself studying details she had perhaps taken for granted over the years. The intricate patterns woven into ancient tapestries, the quiet elegance of stone archways that had witnessed generations of royal history unfold within their shadows. She wondered as she walked how many other individuals throughout the palace's long history had found themselves in similar positions, caught between genuine affection and the unforgiving demands of political necessity. She imagined countless others before her, women and men alike, who had loved someone destined for a throne, only to watch that love dissolve beneath the weight of obligations neither party could fully control. Upon reaching her cabin, she found a small envelope waiting on her table, sealed simply, without the formal royal insignia she had grown accustomed to seeing on official correspondence. She opened it carefully, recognizing Aldrich's handwriting immediately, though the tone felt different from his usual formal communications. The letter was brief, yet carried unexpected warmth. He wrote of memories they had shared together, of gratitude for her presence throughout difficult years of his life, of genuine sorrow regarding the circumstances now unfolding beyond his control. He did not explicitly confirm the alliance, yet the underlying message felt unmistakably clear, a gentle preparation for news he seemed unable to deliver directly, perhaps out of genuine care for her feelings, perhaps out of his own reluctance to fully confront the reality of what he was being asked to sacrifice. Ilara read the letter several times, tears gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed. She recognized, within his careful words, genuine affection that had not entirely disappeared, yet she understood equally that affection alone would not be enough to alter the course events were taking. The kingdom's needs, as defined by the council and reinforced by the Duke's mounting impatience, seemed destined to overshadow whatever personal connection remained between them. She set the letter aside eventually, moving toward her window to watch the sunset, painting brilliant colors across the palace gardens. She found herself thinking, with quiet clarity, about the conversation she had shared with Margot days earlier, about the wisdom of considering a future defined by her own choices rather than circumstances dictated by political necessity. For the first time since the coronation, she allowed herself to imagine, tentatively, what such a future might look like. She thought of distant relatives living in quieter regions of the kingdom, of skills she possessed that might allow her to build an independent life away from the complicated politics of court. The thought carried both fear and, unexpectedly, a small flicker of something resembling hope, as though recognizing that an ending, however painful, might also represent the beginning of something entirely her own. She did not yet know when she would need to make her final decision, but she understood, watching the last light fade from the sky above the palace gardens, that the time for that decision was drawing steadily closer with each passing day. 2 days after receiving Aldrich's letter, Elara woke to the sound of trumpets echoing across the palace grounds, signaling the arrival of another important visitor. She rose quickly, moving to her window to observe a procession of carriages making their way through the main gates, banners bearing unfamiliar heraldry fluttering in the morning breeze. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the main courtyard, curiosity overcoming her earlier reluctance to engage with palace affairs. She found a group of servants gathered near the entrance, watching as the visiting delegation departed their carriages, revealing officials dressed in formal attire, representing what appeared to be a neighboring kingdom. She approached one of the servants quietly, recognizing a young man named Peter who often assisted with palace correspondence. "What is happening?" she asked. Peter glanced at her, surprise briefly crossing his features before he responded. "Representatives from the kingdom of Valemont have arrived, my lady. I overheard that they seek an audience with the king regarding recent tensions along the shared border. Apparently, there have been troubling reports of raids near the frontier villages." Elara's brow furrowed with concern, momentarily distracted from her own troubles by this unexpected news. "Raids? I had not heard of such incidents. Nor had most of the court, until this morning," Peter admitted. "The council has been informed only recently, though rumors suggest tensions have been building for several weeks without public acknowledgement." The news added an unexpected complexity to the political landscape Elara had been navigating in recent days. She wondered, with growing unease, whether these developments might further complicate the delicate balance surrounding the potential Ashworth alliance, perhaps accelerating decisions the council had been debating, or perhaps creating entirely new priorities that shifted attention elsewhere. She spent the following hours observing the palace's heightened activity from a respectful distance, watching messengers rush between various wings of the building, advisors gathering in hurried conferences, and soldiers assembling near the eastern barracks, in numbers greater than she had witnessed since Aldrich's coronation. The atmosphere carried a palpable tension that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the fragile position her own personal concerns occupied within the much larger machinery of kingdom governance. Later that afternoon, she encountered Margot once more, finding the older woman hurrying through the corridors with an armful of documents, her expression carrying visible concern. "Margot," Elara called softly, catching the woman's attention. "What is happening?" "I have heard rumors of trouble along the Valemont border." Margot paused, glancing around briefly, before answering in hushed tones. "The situation appears more serious than initial reports suggested. Several villages near the frontier have experienced coordinated attacks, believed to be orchestrated by factions opposing peaceful relations between our kingdoms. The council fears this may signal deliberate attempts to destabilize the region during this vulnerable period of transition." "Does this affect the discussions regarding the Ashworth alliance?" Elara asked, unable to fully suppress the question weighing most heavily on her own thoughts. Margot's expression softened slightly with sympathy. "I believe it may accelerate certain decisions, Elara. The council will likely view a strong alliance with the Ashworth family as even more critical now, given the need to project stability and strength during this period of external threat. I am sorry to bring you such difficult news." Elara absorbed this information with quiet resignation, recognizing that whatever hope she had harbored for delay or reconsideration was rapidly diminishing under the weight of circumstances entirely beyond anyone's individual control. She thanked Margot for her honesty, before continuing on her way, her thoughts heavy with the accelerating pace of events unfolding around her. That evening, As the palace settled into an uneasy quiet following the day's dramatic developments, Elara found herself drawn toward the eastern gardens once more, seeking the solitude that had become her refuge throughout these difficult weeks. She walked slowly along familiar paths, illuminated by scattered lanterns casting warm light across the carefully tended flower beds. She had not walked far when she encountered Aldrich himself, standing alone near the garden's central fountain, his posture carrying visible exhaustion beneath the weight of the day's events. He looked up as she approached, surprise briefly crossing his features before settling into something resembling relief. "Elara," he said quietly, "I did not expect to see you tonight." "I could not sleep," she admitted. "The palace feels different today, heavier somehow." He nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. "The situation along the Valamont border has complicated matters significantly. I fear the Council will use these developments to argue even more forcefully for swift resolution regarding the Ashworth alliance." "Margot suggested as much," Elara said quietly. Aldrich moved closer, his expression carrying genuine anguish that surprised her, given the careful formality he had maintained throughout their previous conversations. "Elara, I want you to understand that none of this reflects any diminishment of my feelings toward you. The pressures I face now are unlike anything I anticipated when I first considered accepting this crown. I understand the position you are in," Elara said gently, though sorrow colored every word. "I do not envy the choices you must make." "There must be another path," Aldrich said, though his voice carried more desperation than conviction. "Surely, there exists some alternative that does not require sacrificing everything we have built together over these years." Elara studied him carefully, recognizing genuine pain within his expression, yet understanding, with painful clarity, that circumstances had progressed too far for such alternatives to remain realistically available. "Aldrich, I believe you already understand what path the Council will ultimately demand, regardless of what alternatives either of us might wish existed. The border troubles will only strengthen their resolve." He remained silent for a long moment, his expression carrying visible conflict between duty and personal desire. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fear you are right, though I hate to admit it aloud." The admission, though painful, carried a strange sense of relief for Elara, confirming what she had already suspected, while finally receiving honest acknowledgement, rather than careful diplomatic evasion. "Then perhaps it is time we both begin preparing for what comes next," she said quietly, rather than continuing to hope for an outcome that grows less likely with each passing day. Aldrich's expression carried visible pain at her words, yet he did not argue against them, seemingly recognizing the truth she had spoken. They stood together in silence for several long moments, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the moonlit garden, both understanding that whatever remained of their bond was rapidly approaching its final, inevitable conclusion. Eventually, Elara excused herself, needing solitude to process the weight of their conversation. As she walked away, she felt Aldrich's eyes following her departure, though neither of them spoke further words that might delay the painful reality now settling firmly between them. Following her conversation with Aldrich in the garden, Elara returned to her cabin and sat for a long while in the darkness, allowing the weight of everything unfolding around her to settle fully within her heart. She did not light a candle, finding a strange comfort in the shadows that matched the uncertainty clouding her thoughts. She replayed their conversation repeatedly, searching for any hidden meaning she might have missed, yet finding only the same painful conclusion each time. The following morning brought further news that accelerated the pace of events beyond anything Elara had anticipated. She learned, through Rosalind's careful whispers, that the Duke of Ashworth had requested an urgent meeting with the full council, citing the border troubles as evidence supporting immediate action regarding the proposed alliance. The meeting was scheduled for that very afternoon, leaving little time for further deliberation or delay. Elara spent the morning in restless uncertainty, unable to focus on any task for more than a few minutes, before her thoughts returned to the meeting that would likely determine the final course of events. She considered seeking out Aldrich once more, yet recognized that such an attempt would likely prove fruitless, given the demands already placed upon his time by the unfolding crisis. Instead, she chose to walk through the palace grounds, needing movement to help settle the anxious energy building within her. She found herself, without conscious intention, walking toward the small chapel located near the northern edge of the property, a quiet building rarely used except during formal ceremonies or moments of personal reflection. She entered the chapel, finding it empty save for the soft light filtering through stained glass windows, depicting scenes from the kingdom's founding history. She seated herself in one of the simple wooden pews, allowing the quiet solemnity of the space to offer some measure of comfort amid the turmoil consuming her thoughts. As she sat in contemplation, she heard the chapel door open behind her, followed by careful footsteps approaching along the stone floor. She turned to find Margot entering quietly, her expression carrying visible concern, as she noticed Alara seated alone. "I thought I might find you here," Margot said softly, seating herself beside Alara. "I understand the council meets this afternoon." "Yes," Alara confirmed, her voice carrying quiet resignation. "I fear this may be the meeting that finally settles matters, one way or another." Margot reached out, placing a gentle hand over Alara's own. "Whatever the outcome, Alara, I want you to know that you have my deepest respect and sympathy. You have conducted yourself with remarkable grace throughout these difficult weeks, despite circumstances that would test anyone's composure." "Thank you, Margot. Your kindness has meant a great deal to me during this time." They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the quiet chapel offering a peaceful refuge from the mounting tension elsewhere within the palace. Eventually, Margot spoke again, her voice careful yet direct. "Alara, I would encourage you to begin considering practical matters now, rather than waiting for the council's decision to force your hand entirely. Whatever happens this afternoon, you deserve time to prepare thoughtfully for whatever comes next, rather than reacting hastily under pressure." Alara nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom within Margot's careful advice. "I have begun considering such matters already, though I confess the thought of leaving this place, after so many years calling it home, fills me with considerable uncertainty." "Change often does," Margot replied gently, "yet sometimes the most difficult transitions ultimately lead toward paths better suited to our genuine happiness, even when we cannot fully recognize that truth in the midst of difficult circumstances." The conversation offered Alara a measure of comfort, though it did little to ease the anxious anticipation building as the afternoon approached. She thanked Margot for her continued kindness, before eventually returning to her cabin, needing solitude to gather her thoughts, before whatever news the council's meeting might ultimately produce. As the appointed hour for the meeting arrived, Alara found herself unable to remain idle any longer. She left her cabin, and made her way toward the main palace building, drawn by an compulsion she could not fully explain, needing to be near the unfolding events, even if she could not directly witness the meeting itself. She positioned herself in a quiet alcove near the council chamber, close enough to sense the gravity of the proceedings, without directly intruding upon the private deliberations occurring within. She could hear occasional raised voices through the heavy wooden doors, though the specific words remained too muffled to fully discern. Time passed slowly as she waited, each minute stretching interminably, as she imagined the various arguments likely being presented within the chamber, the Duke's mounting impatience, the council's insistence upon swift resolution, and Aldrich's own internal struggle between personal desire and royal duty. She wondered whether he was fighting for an alternative outcome, or whether he had already resigned himself to the inevitable conclusion that seemed increasingly certain with each passing day. Eventually, after what felt like hours though was likely closer to 90 minutes, the council chamber doors opened, and various advisors began filing out, their expressions carrying the particular exhaustion that accompanied difficult, contentious deliberations. Alara watched carefully, searching each face for some indication of the meeting's outcome, yet finding only careful neutrality that revealed nothing definitive. Lord Bennet emerged among the last of the advisors, his expression carrying visible fatigue. He noticed Alara standing in the alcove and paused briefly, his eyes carrying something that might have been sympathy, though his words remained carefully professional. "Lady Alara," he said quietly, "I would advise you to speak with the king directly, when he is available. There have been significant developments this afternoon that likely concern you directly." The careful phrasing offered little reassurance, yet confirmed Alara's growing certainty that the council's meeting had produced conclusions that would fundamentally alter the course of her future within the palace. She thanked Lord Bennet for his acknowledgement before he continued on his way, leaving her alone once more in the quiet alcove, bracing herself for whatever conversation with Aldrich might soon follow. She did not have long to wait. Within minutes, Aldrich emerged from the council chamber, his expression carrying visible exhaustion and something resembling defeat that struck Alara with immediate, painful clarity. He noticed her standing nearby and approached slowly, his eyes carrying a sorrow that confirmed her worst fears, before he even spoke a single word. "Alara," he said softly, his voice heavy with unspoken grief. "We need to speak privately, if you are willing." She nodded silently, following him toward a nearby private chamber, understanding, with quiet resignation, that whatever conversation awaited them would likely mark the definitive conclusion of the uncertain limbo she had endured throughout these difficult weeks. The private chamber Aldrich led her toward was small and sparsely furnished, typically used for brief consultations between the king and individual advisors rather than extended discussions. Alara seated herself near the single window, watching as Aldrich closed the door carefully behind them, ensuring their conversation would remain undisturbed by passing servants or curious courtiers. He remained standing for several long moments, seemingly gathering the courage necessary to share whatever news the council's meeting had produced. Alara waited patiently, though her heart pounded steadily with anxious anticipation, already sensing the painful truth she suspected he was about to confirm. "The council has reached its final decision," Aldrich began, his voice carrying visible strain. "Given the escalating tensions along the Valamont border, they insist the Ashworth alliance must proceed immediately, without further delay. The Duke has agreed to formalize the arrangement within the coming weeks." Alara absorbed the words slowly, feeling their weight settle heavily within her chest, though she had prepared herself, as best she could, for this exact outcome. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice remarkably steady, despite the grief building within her. "Alara, I fought against this outcome for as long as I possibly could," Aldrich continued, moving closer, his expression carrying genuine anguish. "I argued for alternative solutions, for delayed timelines, for any path that might preserve what exists between us. Yet the council remained unified in their insistence, and the border crisis has left me with insufficient leverage to continue resisting their demands." "I do not blame you for the decision," Alara said gently, though tears had begun gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed. "You carry responsibilities toward an entire kingdom, responsibilities that necessarily outweigh personal considerations, however painful that reality proves to be." Aldrich knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently within his own, his eyes carrying visible sorrow. "I want you to understand that this decision does not reflect any diminishment of what I have felt for you throughout these years. You have been the steadiest, most genuine presence in my life, long before I ever anticipated wearing this crown." "I know," Alara whispered, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I have always known the genuine nature of your affection, Aldrich. That knowledge does not make this moment any easier to bear, yet it offers some small comfort amid the pain." They remained together in silence for several long moments, both allowing the weight of their shared history to settle fully within the quiet chamber. Eventually, Aldrich spoke again, his voice carrying careful hesitation. "Alara, I would understand entirely if you wished to remain within the palace, perhaps in a different capacity, one that would allow you to maintain some connection to this place you have called home for so many years." Alara considered his offer carefully, recognizing the genuine care behind the suggestion, yet understanding, with painful clarity, that remaining within the palace under such altered circumstances would likely prove more agonizing than any alternative she might pursue. "I appreciate the offer, Aldrich, truly. But I believe, given everything that has transpired, it would be far more difficult for me to remain here, watching your new life unfold alongside Lady Seraphine, than to build something entirely my own, elsewhere." Aldrich's expression carried visible pain at her words, though he did not argue against the wisdom within them. "I understand your reasoning, though it grieves me deeply to consider you leaving this place, and leaving my life, after everything we have shared together. Change often brings grief alongside necessity," Alara said softly, echoing words Margot had shared with her days earlier. "I believe, in time, we will both find peace with whatever path lies ahead, even if that peace feels impossibly distant in this particular moment." They spoke for a while longer, exchanging memories from years past, acknowledging the genuine bond they had shared, despite the painful circumstances now separating them. Aldrich offered to provide whatever resources she might need to establish herself independently, an offer Alara accepted with quiet gratitude, recognizing the practical necessity of accepting such support, despite her pride urging otherwise. As their conversation drew toward its natural conclusion, Aldrich rose slowly, his expression carrying visible reluctance to end this final private moment between them. I do not know when the Ashworth alliance will be formally announced to the wider court, though I suspect it will happen within the coming days, given the council's insistence upon swift resolution. Then I believe it would be wisest for me to make my own arrangements to depart before such an announcement occurs, Alara said quietly, her voice carrying newfound resolve, despite the grief still weighing heavily within her heart. I would prefer to leave this place on my own terms, rather than remaining to witness the formal celebration of an arrangement that marks the end of everything we once shared. Aldrich nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression, though sorrow remained etched across his features. I will ensure whatever arrangements you require are provided swiftly and without complication. You deserve, at minimum, a departure, conducted with dignity, given everything you have offered throughout these years. They parted shortly after, both understanding that their next meeting, whenever it might occur, would carry an entirely different quality than the countless private conversations they had shared throughout their years together. Alara returned to her cabin that evening carrying a strange mixture of profound grief and quiet resolve, understanding that the time had finally arrived for her to begin planning, in earnest, the departure that circumstances had made increasingly inevitable. She spent the remainder of the evening in careful consideration, beginning to sketch out plans for where she might travel, what resources she would need, and how swiftly she could arrange her departure without drawing undue attention from the wider court. She thought of distant relatives living near the kingdom's southern coast, individuals she had not visited in several years, yet who might offer temporary refuge while she determined her longer-term path forward. As night deepened around her cabin, Alara found herself surprisingly calm, having finally moved beyond the uncertain limbo that had consumed her thoughts throughout recent weeks. She understood, with quiet clarity, that whatever pain remained from this painful conclusion, she now possessed the freedom to shape her own future, unburdened by the political complexities that had governed her existence within these palace walls for so many years. The following 2 days passed in a blur of quiet preparation for Alara, as she carefully arranged the practical details of her impending departure, while attempting to maintain a composed appearance before the wider court. She informed only Margot and Rosalind of her plans, trusting their discretion completely, while recognizing that news of her departure would inevitably spread once it became known. Margot assisted her considerably during this period, helping arrange transportation, and providing guidance regarding practical matters Alara had never needed to consider during her years within the sheltered environment of palace life. You will need funds sufficient to establish yourself independently, Margot advised during one of their private conversations. The king has arranged a generous provision, though you would be wise to manage these resources carefully until you determine a sustainable path forward. I intend to visit my aunt near the southern coast initially, Alara explained. She has offered refuge in the past, and I believe her guidance will prove valuable as I consider longer-term possibilities. Margot nodded approvingly, a sensible plan. Distance from the palace will likely aid your healing considerably, allowing you space to rebuild your sense of self, away from constant reminders of what you are leaving behind. Rosalind, meanwhile, assisted with more immediate practical matters, helping Alara pack her belongings quietly during evening hours when fewer servants moved through the palace corridors, reducing the likelihood of curious observations that might prematurely reveal her departure plans. The young servant's loyalty and discretion provided Alara with considerable comfort during this emotionally difficult process. I shall miss you greatly, my lady, Rosalind said quietly one evening, as they folded garments carefully into a modest traveling trunk. You have always treated me with kindness that many others of higher station rarely offer those who serve them. You have been a genuine friend throughout difficult times, Rosalind, Alara replied warmly. I hope our paths might cross again someday, under happier circumstances than those currently surrounding us. As the second day drew toward its conclusion, Alara received word that the formal announcement regarding the Ashworth alliance would occur within 3 days' time, during a grand ceremony intended to celebrate the strengthened partnership between the two families. The timeline confirmed her earlier instinct that she needed to depart before such a public celebration occurred, sparing herself the anguish of witnessing formal confirmation of an arrangement that marked the definitive conclusion of her bond with Aldrich. She saw Aldrich only once more during these final preparations, a brief encounter in the palace gardens that neither had anticipated, yet both seemed to welcome, despite the underlying sorrow accompanying their conversation. He appeared visibly burdened by the mounting pressures of the impending announcement, his expression carrying exhaustion that Alara recognized from countless difficult moments throughout their years of friendship. "I understand you plan to depart soon," he said quietly, as they walked together along a familiar garden path. Before the formal announcement, Alara confirmed, "I believe it would be easier for both of us if I were not present to witness that particular ceremony." Aldrich nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression, though sorrow remained etched clearly across his features. "I wish circumstances had allowed for a different outcome, Alara. Truly, I do." "I know," she said gently, "and I believe, in time, you will find genuine contentment within the path now set before you, even if that contentment looks different from what either of us once imagined for ourselves." They walked together in comfortable silence for several minutes, both savoring what they understood would likely be among their final private moments together. Eventually, Aldrich spoke again, his voice carrying careful vulnerability, rarely displayed during his recent, more formal interactions. "Will you write to me, once you have settled somewhere new? I would appreciate knowing you remain well, even from a distance." Alara considered his request carefully before responding. "Perhaps, once sufficient time has passed for both of us to find peace with this new arrangement. I do not believe immediate correspondence would serve either of our healing processes particularly well." Aldrich accepted her answer with quiet grace, recognizing the wisdom within her careful boundary. They continued walking until reaching the garden's edge, where their paths would naturally diverge, Aldrich returning toward the palace's busier sections, while Alara continued toward the quieter grounds surrounding her cabin. "Farewell, Aldrich," she said softly, as they paused at the point where their paths separated. "I wish you genuine happiness, whatever form that happiness ultimately takes." "Farewell, Alara," he replied, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. "I will carry gratitude for our years together, always, regardless of how circumstances have ultimately unfolded." They parted then, both understanding the finality embedded within that simple farewell, though neither lingered further, recognizing that prolonged goodbyes would likely only deepen the pain already accompanying their separation. Alara continued toward her cabin, her heart heavy yet strangely settled, having finally achieved the honest closure she had sought throughout these difficult weeks. That evening, she completed her final preparations for departure, arranging her modest belongings carefully within the traveling trunk Rosalind had helped her pack. She wrote a brief letter, intended for Aldrich, explaining her decision to depart quietly rather than remain for any formal farewell ceremony that might draw unwanted attention or complicate the delicate political situation surrounding the impending alliance announcement. She placed the letter carefully upon her small writing desk, positioned where it would be easily discovered once her absence became apparent the following morning. She then extinguished her candles and settled into bed, though sleep proved elusive, given the significance of the departure awaiting her before dawn's first light. She lay awake for several hours, reviewing the plans she had carefully arranged, ensuring nothing had been overlooked that might complicate her early morning departure. She thought of the carriage Margot had arranged, waiting discreetly near the palace's eastern gate, ready to carry her toward the southern coast and whatever new life awaited her beyond these familiar walls. As the night deepened around her, Alara found herself surprisingly at peace with the decision, now firmly settled within her heart. Whatever pain accompanied this significant transition, she understood, with quiet certainty, that remaining within a situation, no longer serving her happiness, would only prolong suffering, better addressed through the courage of genuine change. She closed her eyes finally, allowing exhaustion to overtake her, knowing that when she woke, her new life would already be beginning. Alara woke while darkness still blanketed the palace grounds, the faintest hint of gray light barely visible along the eastern horizon. She rose quietly, dressing swiftly in traveling clothes she had prepared the previous evening, moving with careful precision to avoid unnecessary noise that might alert nearby servants to her early departure. She checked her small traveling trunk once more, ensuring everything necessary had been packed securely, before glancing around her cabin one final time, allowing herself a brief moment to absorb the familiar surroundings that had served as her home for so many years. The modest furnishings, the small window overlooking the gardens, the writing desk where countless quiet evenings had been spent in reflection and correspondence, all carried memories she would forever treasure, despite the painful circumstances now prompting her departure. She retrieved the letter she had written the previous evening, reading through it one final time, to ensure her words conveyed the genuine sentiment she intended. The letter explained her decision simply, without bitterness or accusation, acknowledging the genuine bond they had shared, while recognizing the political necessities that had ultimately reshaped both their futures. She expressed gratitude for the years of friendship and support, along with sincere hope that Aldrich would find lasting happiness within his new arrangement. She placed the letter carefully upon her writing desk, positioned where it would be easily discovered, before lifting her traveling trunk and making her way quietly toward the cabin door. She paused briefly at the threshold, glancing back one final time at the room that had witnessed so much of her life within these palace walls, before stepping outside into the cool pre-dawn air. The palace grounds remained largely quiet at this early hour, save for the occasional distant sound of servants beginning their earliest morning duties. Alara moved carefully along familiar paths, grateful for the darkness that helped conceal her movement, toward the eastern gate, where Margot had arranged for a carriage to await her arrival. She encountered no one during her careful journey across the grounds, the palace seemingly holding its breath in the final moments before dawn fully arrived. She reached the eastern gate within 20 minutes, finding the promised carriage waiting exactly where Margot had indicated, the driver offering a respectful nod as she approached. "Lady Alara," he said quietly, taking her traveling trunk and securing it properly. "I have been instructed to take you wherever you wish to travel, with complete discretion regarding this journey." "Thank you," Alara replied softly, settling into the carriage as the driver prepared to depart. "I wish to travel toward the southern coast, to the estate belonging to Lady Constance, my aunt." The driver nodded, understanding the destination, before climbing onto his seat and setting the carriage into motion. Alara settled back against the cushioned seat, watching through the small window as the palace gradually receded behind her, its familiar silhouette growing smaller against the lightening sky. She felt a complex mixture of emotions as the carriage carried her farther from the only home she had known for so many years. Grief remained present, undeniable and significant, yet alongside that grief existed something unexpected, a quiet sense of liberation, as though a weight she had carried unknowingly for years had finally begun lifting from her shoulders. The journey toward the southern coast would take several days, providing ample time for reflection during the quiet hours spent traveling through the countryside. Alara watched the landscape gradually transform, from the familiar hills surrounding the palace, toward more varied terrain, forests giving way to open farmland, distant villages appearing and disappearing, as the carriage continued its steady progress southward. Meanwhile, back at the palace, dawn arrived fully, bringing with it the routine bustle of servants beginning their daily responsibilities. Rosalind, aware of Alara's planned departure, made her way toward the modest cabin shortly after sunrise, intending to offer one final farewell before returning to her regular duties. She knocked softly upon the cabin door, receiving no response, before pushing it open carefully to discover the room entirely empty, save for the letter resting prominently upon the writing desk. Rosalind's heart clenched with a mixture of sadness and quiet understanding, recognizing that Alara had indeed followed through with her carefully arranged departure. She retrieved the letter, understanding its intended recipient, before making her way swiftly toward the main palace building, seeking out Aldrich to deliver the difficult news personally, rather than allowing him to discover the empty cabin through less considerate means. She found him in his private study, already engaged in early morning discussions with several advisors regarding preparations for the upcoming Ashworth Alliance announcement. She waited respectfully near the doorway until he noticed her presence, immediately sensing something significant in her careful expression. "Rosalind," he said, excusing himself briefly from his advisors. "What is it?" She approached quietly, offering him the sealed letter. "Lady Alara has departed, Your Majesty. Her cabin was empty when I arrived this morning. She left this letter for you." Aldrich accepted the letter with visible reluctance, his expression carrying the weight of anticipated grief even before breaking the seal. He excused himself from his advisors entirely, moving toward the privacy of his study's window as he opened the letter carefully, reading through Alara's carefully composed words. The letter confirmed everything he had feared, expressing gratitude and understanding rather than bitterness, yet carrying an undeniable finality that settled heavily within his chest. He read the words twice, absorbing the genuine sentiment behind each carefully chosen phrase, recognizing the remarkable grace with which Alara had approached even this most painful conclusion to their years of shared history. He stood silently by the window for several long minutes, watching the palace gardens below, the same gardens where they had shared countless conversations throughout the years, now carrying a bittersweet quality, given everything that had transpired. He understood, with painful clarity, that she had made the right decision for herself, however much her absence would leave a genuine void within his own life moving forward. Later that morning, Margot found him still standing near the window, his expression carrying visible grief, despite his attempts to maintain composure before the busy palace staff. She approached quietly, understanding immediately what had occurred. "She has departed then," Margot said gently, more statement than question. "Yes," Aldrich confirmed, his voice carrying quiet sorrow. "Before dawn, it seems. Her cabin was already empty when Rosalind arrived this morning." Margot placed a comforting hand upon his shoulder, offering silent support during this difficult moment. "She has shown remarkable courage throughout these past weeks, Your Majesty. I believe she will build a genuinely meaningful life for herself, wherever her journey ultimately leads." Aldrich nodded slowly, finding some measure of comfort within Margot's reassurance, though the weight of loss remained heavy within his heart. "I hope, truly, that she finds the happiness and peace she deserves, even if that path no longer includes a place within my own life." As the day progressed, preparations for the Ashworth Alliance announcement continued moving forward, the palace gradually filling with activity as servants prepared decorations and arrangements for the upcoming celebration. Yet amid this bustling preparation, Aldrich carried a quiet, persistent awareness of the significant absence now present within his daily existence, a void left by the departure of someone who had shaped so much of his personal journey throughout the years preceding his ascension to the throne. Meanwhile, several days southward, Alara's carriage finally arrived at her aunt's modest coastal estate, marking the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. Lady Constance welcomed her warmly, offering the comfort and support Alara needed as she began processing the significant transitions now shaping her future. Standing upon the coastal cliffs that evening, watching waves crash rhythmically against distant rocks below, Alara felt a quiet sense of resolve settling firmly within her heart. She understood that grief would likely accompany her for some time longer, yet she recognized equally that she now possessed something invaluable, the freedom to shape a future entirely her own, built upon her own choices rather than circumstances dictated by political necessity or the complicated demands of royal life. She had left behind the palace that once felt like home, along with the bond she had cherished for so many years. Yet standing there, watching the sun set brilliantly over unfamiliar waters, she recognized the quiet beginning of something entirely new, a chapter defined not by loss, but by the courage required to build a genuinely fulfilling life on her own terms, however uncertain that path might initially appear.